Today, about two-thirds of men, about a third of women in the church say they have an ongoing struggle with internet pornography. And so we're going to stretch here a little bit today. Now, I'm only going to use a couple of words that you might say, well, maybe this isn't right for the age of my kids. I'll use the P word that I just used to describe the inappropriate content, and I'll use the S word to describe what God gave, what God designed. And if that's of any concern, feel free that you're welcome to leave. Today we're going to talk about raising courageous Christians to confront the sexualized culture. It really might surprise you. Doesn't it surprise you that there's very little difference between the church and our general population of the United States when it comes to viewing inappropriate content? Isn't that just a little bit shocking? Isn't that just a little bit surprising? Josh McDowell and other church leaders have called internet pornography in today's culture the biggest threat to the church, to the modern church. So when we think about Christians resisting a sexualized culture, because it's on TV, it's on the billboards, our sexualized media is everywhere. And it just so happens that pornography has had a big impact in pushing sexualized messages through all these venues because it's become more and more and more and more acceptable. You remember back in the 90s when who remembers Friends? Yeah, there's like reruns now, right? And the guys get free cable, and on their cable they actually get an inappropriate channel. And they're all getting popcorn so they can watch it for hours and hours. You see how it began pushing further and further and further into mainstream culture. So we shouldn't be surprised that so much sexualized messages that we see in the mall and on the billboards, on our televisions, are constantly seeming to push the envelope. And we've had a weak resistance as a church body. A weak resistance that says, this is a delicate subject. We shouldn't talk about this in the church. Someone might get offended. I had a pastor say, well, I'm not sure I can speak about this in our church because I was reading from the Bible and in there was the word prostitute, and I was just reading from the Bible and I got talked to after the sermon. Really? This is the culture we live in, and we must confront it. We must confront it. So to resist means there's going to be some tension. To resist means that we're going to have to do some fighting. We're going to have to put on the gloves, and we're going to have to go to work. To resist means not only for our own lives, but we're going to have to create an authentic community. And what I've seen here this morning as I joined you in worship this morning, and I've kind of watched what some of the videos on your church website, I've been encouraged about an authentic community that can address and discuss anything because we want healing. We want healing. James said, confess your sins to one another and pray for one another so that you might be healed. I saw on your website that you have a Celebrate Recovery group here. Who's got Celebrate? I can't do that, can I? Hey, I just want to give a shout out to you guys, gals. Thank you. Thank you for having a church, because so many churches are saying, well, Celebrate Recovery, we might get some people in our church that we don't really know. No, thank you for having a healing community. Let me tell you just a couple of quick stories. I was talking to a mom, and she said, after a session like this, we're going to do everything that you were going to do, but we put it off. We just said, we got to get to that. We just put it off. And so they sent us an email, and it was a call later, and said, we just discovered our 10-year-old son has been on a 2-week porn binge. And my daughter had walked in on him. And he says, Mom, I knew it was wrong. I just couldn't stop clicking. I don't know why I couldn't stop clicking, but I just couldn't stop clicking. And as I start off here this morning, I'm going to talk to you about children. We're going to talk about adults and young adults and older adults and teens and children. But I have to say that as I've traveled, I've literally talked to thousands of people individually, talked to many audiences as well. But a common thread among those who have compulsive behaviors with especially pornography, but with sexualized media, is that they were exposed often at a very young age. And it gets its hooks into them. And it's hard to let go of that. And it creates a pattern. And we're going to talk about how does that happen. How does it happen when a dad came to me after a session like this and he says, we thought everything was just fine. We had a great kid who did well in school. He was in sports. We went to church every Sunday, every time the doors were open. We didn't allow the internet in our house because we wanted to be so protective, but he tapped into the neighbor's internet and he found internet elsewhere. We didn't know anything was wrong until the FBI showed up at our door. He'd asked who he thought was a 13-year-old girl to meet him for sex. Who do we want to raise our children? Who do we want to be as men and women of God? We want to be courageous. We want to stand up to a world and confront it and say, no, this matters. Let me tell you another story. This was 2 months ago. Mom came running up to our table and says, hey, I've just got to tell you, we did exactly what you said. And this year, you see, who is Covenant-Eyes? Let me give you a brief overview of what Covenant-Eyes does. We invented this thing called internet accountability. And what it does, it monitors how the internet is used on your phones, tablets, and computers. And then it sends a report to someone you trust, whether it's your accountability partner or whether that's to mom and dad. And then you use those reports to have an ongoing conversation about what we see and do online. And for each person, you can have just accountability, and I'm only held accountable. I can go anywhere I want to on the internet. I'm not blocked from anything. But my report goes to 3 guys at my church and to my wife. My son comes right behind me on the same devices, and he's both filtered through Covenant-Eyes. It works differently for each individual in a home. He's filtered at his age, blocking inappropriate content at his age level, and his reports come to me and my wife. And then we turn that into conversations. So this mom comes running up to our table and she says, I talked to you last year and I just had to come up and let you know what happened this year. You see, my 7-year-old son was exposed to hardcore pornography. I thought, this is good news? He says he immediately came to me and let me know what happened because I'd been getting his report and I did exactly like you said. We began having an ongoing conversation. I began teaching him that inappropriate content was going to come at him someday and he needed to be prepared for it. And if he saw something like this, then he needed to immediately come to me. And he did. With a little bit digging deeper, it found out that this 7-year-old that took it basically an iPad and said, here, look, you got to see this. Who had done that to her 7-year-old, that 7-year-old had been exposing 7, 8, and 9-year-olds throughout their whole neighborhood. Her son was the only one who was knowledgeable enough, courageous enough, and knew it was safe to come to mom and dad. And that's what we want to do. We want to train our kids. So we want to protect them because we don't want the next generation ending up like many of adults today. Many millennials, many young adults, many college students, and older. You see, pornography doesn't have a demographic, as famously stated by a pornographer who is bragging about it. It crosses all demographics. Let me tell you another story. This is a story about my son. Because everything has got to be protected in my house, right? I've got a police officer here, the police chief on this side. I've got a sheriff's deputy just down the street from me. I knew everything my kids were doing. Don't you feel sorry for them? They'd be out somewhere. So, Hannah, Ben, where you been? I know. Oh, no, that's not where you've been. This is where you've been. Isn't that funny? All right. So I've got everything protected in my home. But another 8-year-old boy exposed my son when he was 8 years old to hardcore pornography. He had just gotten an iPod Touch for Christmas, slipped it into his backpack, and brought it in my house, and I didn't realize that he had brought an iPod in the house. I just have a habit of collecting those devices. I remember collecting a device from a 10-year-old coming in my house, and immediately says, my brother's been home from the Navy. I don't know what he's been doing on my iPad. Well, I knew what I was going to find, and I did. And I wrapped my arms around him, and I says, hey, listen, I'm going to keep your device, but you just come spend the night. It's all right. You are not struggling with something that many men and women in our church aren't struggling with too. And I'm not going to leave you. Man, that kid would make a beeline for me every Sunday morning because I didn't shame him. I showed him love, showed him authentic community. So this 8-year-old boy comes to my home and he exposes my 8-year-old son. But let's fast forward to when my son's 13 and he gets in my car and he says, Dad, guys are dumb. And I said, okay, son, I love a good story. Why are guys dumb? He says, they're standing around soccer practice today talking about their favorite porn to watch, what acts they like to see, what sites they want to go to. And they look at me and they say, come on, Ben, what kind of porn do you watch? And he goes, I don't watch porn. I'm like, give me a break, everybody watches porn. He goes, guys, the first reason I watch porn is I'm a Christian. And they go, so what? We go to church too. And others were like, that's your thing, whatever. And he says, guys, don't you know how addictive this can be? And they're like, no way, we could stop anytime we wanted to. And he says, if that's true, why are so many men and women seeking therapy today for porn addiction and sex addiction? What about guys like Tiger Woods, who is married to a supermodel, yet that's not enough? I don't have a comeback for that. And so he says, guys, what does it say about you if you get excited by watching a slave? I'm like, what are you talking about? He says, pornography is contributing to sex trafficking, and sex trafficking is contributing to pornography. When you do a Google search for porn, you're going to be looking at a slave. What does that say about you? Now you got a picture. I don't know what you were like when you were 13, but I don't know if I was quite that stunningly brave. We need to be courageous Christians who can stand in the world and be as brave as a 13-year-old and say, this matters to me. It matters to my God. It matters to a world that's enslaved. It's going to matter to my future spouse or my current spouse. It's going to matter to my children or my future children. God has called us not to be slaves to sin, not to be slaves to the sexualized culture that would like to draw us in. We are called to be slaves to Christ. I said I want to start off just talking a little bit about kids. The average age for kids, depending on which study you're viewing, is between the ages of 10 and 13. Between 10 and 13 is the average ages. That means a lot of kids younger are being exposed than older. 71% of kids, well, I'll come back to that later. But there's 4 myths that parents and grandparents often just can't accept that a kid would be exposed. Myth number 1 is my child is just a good kid. He would never do that. She would never do that. They'd never be interested. That would never have any impact on one of our children. If they saw it, they'd just look away. It wouldn't have any way to get its talons into them. The measures I have in place are good enough. And usually that means that they keep a device in an open kitchen or living room. Boys are the only ones who struggle. The younger you go on the demographic, the more likely a young girl or woman is seeking intentionally pornography. But I was at a major denomination event, and one of its representatives, one of the voters, et cetera, came in, and she was at my table, and she says, and she was probably in her 50s, and she said, I've got to get this for my, I've got boys, I've got older teens, and I've got some college students in my house, and we need this. And then she stopped, she paused, and she looked at me very sincerely, and she said, I need this for me. I've struggled with this for years. I need this. I need to get open with somebody. There's a beliefs versus reality. 71% of kids say they hide on what they do online from mom and dad. Yet 82% of parents were even aware that their kids know how to hide portions of their history. Today we're graduating our first generations who don't know a world without the internet. Of those 2/3 of Christian men, 77% of men 18 to 30 say they have an ongoing struggle. 36% of those 77% say it's every day. I was talking to a man, and he said, when I got to day 3 of not viewing pornography, when I got to day 3, I realized it was the first time that I'd gone 3 days without viewing since I was a teenager, and he was in his 40s. Again, this is crossing all demographics, and it's having horrible consequences. In 56% of divorce cases today, a major contributing factor to the split is a compulsive use of pornography by one spouse or the other. This is a totally secular statistic from the Matrimonial Lawyers Association. The impact on the brain, it changes how we think. And so, Time Magazine last year, it had the word, it was April of 2016, and across the cover had the word porn, X through, and it says, why a generation of men raised on pornography are becoming advocates for turning it off. That was the subhead. Because it didn't work in real life. They had so trained their brains to focus on this. Why do people get stuck? Why? How is this possible? Well, we often believe some myths. There we go. I've heard many guys say, God and women, God made me this way. He created this drive in me to be sexual, and he did. He did not design you to ogle a screen. He did not design you to watch this inappropriate content. He made you to leave and to cleave. Evolution made me this way. I was meant to roam the savannah and spread my gene pool as far and wide as possible. We know that everything in science shows that we're not like the other creatures. We love the sound of a voice. Things that are attractive to us are much different. Number 3, I can never break free. I'm stuck this way. Can never get out. There was a time when I felt like that. I was exposed early. I came from a violent home. And so pornography was my secret salve. It was that thing I ran to when I was fearful and afraid or had anxiety or whatever. I didn't realize that I was using it for healing or to cover up my pain. But it followed me into marriage. We weren't Christians, so I had a magazine laying out back. This is before the internet, thank goodness. And my wife says, I saw this on your workbench, and I don't think we can have this in the home. I don't think this works. And I says, that's fine, honey. It doesn't matter. I love you. I don't love this. And so I threw it all away. I did. And then my brain began to have cravings, and I couldn't understand why. Aren't I in control of me? I'm so grateful that my sister began ministering to my my wife. She introduced her to Jesus Christ. And then I was in a church, and the pastor he just ignored everybody else and preached to me. And that's where I learned about accountability. It's where I learned about getting real, authentic with someone, and how this was addictive. It's creating compulsive behaviors. We need to be a church body of Christ that does that again and again and again. We set the captives free. This is a spiritual issue. It is a mental issue. It is a neurological issue. It is all wrapped up together. Let me introduce you to a term that you may or may not have heard before. It's called neuroplasticity or brain plasticity. And it's just kind of a phrase that means the brain is more plastic, more moldable than it is ceramic, not so hard. In other words, that throughout our lifetime, we can create new neural pathways based on our behaviors and our especially repetition. And so it used to be thought when you're age 21 or 22 that you're just stuck. You know, you were raised, and however you were raised, that's who you're going to be for the rest of your life. But neuroscience has shown us that we can create new neural pathways through new and positive habits throughout our lifetime, or negative habits. In other words, we can actually learn what we like. We can actually create compulsive behaviors. Noah, you said you had joined me. Would you mind come up? Give him a cheer.
For the record, I was volunteered for this from a friend.
So, Noah, back in Elizabethan times, men and women would be you're stepping away, like, they'd be very romantic, and they'd want to, but they were obsessed with body odor. And so a girl I'll play the girl, is that okay? He's fine with that. All right, so they would peel an apple, and then she would put it under her armpit, and it'd allow it to absorb all that stink and sweat, because they just thought body odors were awesome. Like Jim Locker, this is the best. And so she would let all that sweat and stink and absorb, and then she'd give it to her beau. Yeah, and then she'd smell it, just a quick sniff. I can't believe you did that. It's terrible. So, and then he would keep that apple with him, because you're not giving that back. and then you just keep smelling that, and you remember our adoration for one another. Is it okay? Now, thanks, give him a cheer. Now, that doesn't make any sense, does it? Today, we cover up our odors, our body odor, with synthetic aromas of flowers and fruits and things of that nature. We've taught our brains what is attractive. The Maasai tribe of East Africa, they will use urine from cows in a lotion for their hair. Now that sounds kind of repugnant, but it shows the value of the cow in their culture. So what happens? What happens in the brain? You see, God designed this. I stand in awe. And if you read throughout the scriptures, the neurological science is right in the Bible. It's right there. It describes that if you do wrong, this will happen. But if you do well, this will happen. God has repeatedly shown us that our habits form who we are. As a man thinks, so is he. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So God created this beautiful thing to draw a husband and wife so close. It's beautiful. Let me make it clear that our sexualized media and pornography is not sex. It's a hijacking, as Satan always does, to what God creates good. It's a hijacking of what God created. And so one of the things that fire off when these cues are picked up, and more specifically, is dopamine. And dopamine is present in all chemical addictions. And we produce dopamine when sexual cues are picked up, and it gives you that spritz of something that feels good, and it gives you focus. It drives you forward. It gives you tunnel vision. Isn't that God amazing? He brought a husband and wife together, and they can focus. The whole world disappears, and you're together. God created that. Dopamine is hijacked by pornography, by sexualized media. One thing that's not on here, and I'll come to it next, is testosterone. Now, testosterone is released in men and women, but especially in men and boys when sexual cues are picked up. The problem for the pornography user is the repetition, because testosterone is also slow to dissipate. It creates a heightened sexual awareness. So men and young men are walking around undressing, modestly dressed, because they are in a constant state of heightened sexual awareness, because they have literally created a chemical imbalance in their bodies. Norepinephrine helps you burn those memories into the brain, whether it's a good experience or this negative experience with inappropriate content. That's why everyone here pretty much can remember the first time that they were exposed to pornography. You can remember that. Now, I'll come back to that later. Oxytocin, that bonding hormone, it's meant, just to create that closeness. It's also released at the end, and it just bonds you so close together. For the pornography user, that's a bad thing, because now they're bonding to the situation. They're bonding to, I'm here, I was fearful, and now I've got this release. That's what they're bonding to. Serotonin, the natural opiates, the fireworks show that makes everything feel good and bring calm. God designed that, but it's been hijacked. Our reward system has been hijacked. And as that reward system is repeated and repeated, neuroplasticity operates under this principle of use it or lose it. The more you do something, the easier it becomes. You ever did something for the first time and it was really hard, but you did it a few times and it became easy? Same thing with this. Neurons that fire together, they wire together. And that repetition ingrains those neural pathways. So I want to come back to what I was going to tell you about children and being exposed, because many moms and dads will worry, if they see something, I can never take that away. And that's true. It's going to be burned into the brain. But the repetition is the thing that really causes the problem. That's what creates the compulsive behavior, that creates slaves to sin. So if we can train our kids, discipline them well, teach them well, disciple them well, and we're specific about what's coming after them, then when they are exposed, they can come to us and tell us, so that we create an environment of healing. So it doesn't get them stuck. What we don't want to do is create hiding and shame, so they can't tell mom and dad, because mom and dad knew they wouldn't be able to talk to me about that. So this is where people get stuck, or this is the symptoms of being stuck. Sensitization, they're very easily turned on. It doesn't take much. You're going to focus on that, see that, even to somewhat related stimuli. Triggers. You might have met someone who smoked, and they'd have a cigarette, or they'd have a cup of coffee, and boy, that just seemed right. This is the perfect time for a cigarette. The same is true for this inappropriate content. Maybe it's stress. Maybe it's, I'm alone. Everybody's out of the house. You saw this especially when we didn't have so many handheld devices. I've talked to men and women who said, there was going to be an outing or they were going to go to visit some relatives or something. They had to make an excuse not to go. They had the work to do or whatever. And it was also they can get in front of a computer. Desensitization. It simply means you need a higher dose. What used to do it isn't enough. Dr. Norman Doidge, in a book called The Brain That Changes Itself, he says, pornographers love to tell you that they're pushing the envelope of what's acceptable. But what they're not telling you is that they have to, because what used to be exciting enough isn't enough anymore. It needs to be more aggressive, more of it. They've become desensitized to what they've seen in the past. There was a university study I think it's about 4 years ago. And what they did was they reviewed the most popular titles, and they found that 88% of the scenes showed physical aggression, usually toward the woman. That's not what God designed. Hyperfrontality. This should be number 4. Hyperfrontality is the last one on there, hyperfrontality. And you can exchange the word compulsiveness with this. Compulsiveness. That basically, think of the prefrontal cortex of the brain, that red highlighted part of the brain up there in front, as a muscle. And the more you use it, the stronger it becomes. So if you say no to something enough, that it becomes stronger. But for the person with repetition using inappropriate content, that's weak. Can't say no. So let's talk about our kids again. Because the prefrontal cortex of the brain doesn't fully show up until ages 21 or 22. So we put cookies on the table, chocolate chip cookies, or what's your favorite cookie? What was that? Peanut butter cookies. I had one last night. That was awesome. It was really good. So the peanut butter cookies are sitting on the counter or on the table, and you say, kids, don't touch the cookies. What happens to the cookies? They disappear. Now let's change that to something more severe than cookies. Remember, dopamine loves novelty. I don't think I said that before, but one thing dopamine loves is novelty. The more novel it is, the more it's going to fire off. So a child seeing pornography for the first time, this fireworks show begins going off in their brain, yet they lack the full prefrontal cortex to actually make the decisions. We've been vague with them enough to say, okay, son, daughter, if you see something that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, or makes you a little nervous, you just come and tell us. They don't know what you're talking about. It's not if our kids are going to be exposed, but when, and are they going to be prepared? Are they going to be prepared to deal with it? So let's join a resistance. Let's join a resistance together. We have to be that authentic, healing community. A community that can draw around one another. The Bible says, you who are mature, you who are spiritual, gently correct. I believe we have some strong, spiritual, mature Christians in this church. And I want to encourage you, embolden you, that you might say, well, this isn't my problem. I don't have any issues here. Let's create healing because it's creating an impact, a ripple effect across our churches, across our communities, and across our family homes. We want to help you do that. We've provided you more than 20 separate educational ebooks. They're just part of a community. And Karen Potter's here today, and she's going to tell you more about that. She's our director of communities for churches across the United States, a champion that's really helping. And she's going to tell you about that in just a few minutes. But I just So what do we do now? What happens? How do we become this? How can we help someone in need? Well, one thing that's very common is we set a 90-day goal. And that means pulling out a calendar. And if you're walking with your friend or whatever, you start a calendar and you mark out your first 90 days. Today's day 1. And if you're struggling today, or if you know a friend who's struggling, would you walk with them and make today, the first day of freedom? Tomorrow's number 2. The end of the week is day 7. And you need to celebrate those days, not only to track the progress, but also to create celebrations of freedom. Please invite someone to walk with you. Be that accountability partner. We have a book called Coming Clean. It actually talks about how to have a gospel-centered accountability relationship. There needs to be, it's not on this list, but this is very important. Simply ignoring bad behaviors isn't the key. Yes, you need to ignore the bad behaviors. You need to push those away. You need to fight against those, but you need to create some positive behaviors in your life. Daily disciplines like prayer and Bible reading, a hobby that's fun, enjoyable. Exercise is a great dopamine producer. And you're ignoring old pathways and creating new ones. And that takes time. And we have to remember that this 90 days is full of peril. Full of peril. And giving in will set one back because that pathway is dopamine filled. It's ready to go. There's lots of on-ramps for that pathway. But we have to ignore it. If it's a slip, that's one thing. If it's binging or whatever, well, reset the clock. Clean imaginations. Paul told us to take every thought captive. Because if you look at the letter A and see it, or you think of the letter A and envision it, the same parts of the brain that light up. If you're watching inappropriate content or let your imaginations run wild, the same parts of the brain are going to be lighting up. We have to address the pain of the past. We have to be vigilant. We have to have positive thinking. Let me encourage you, parents. You know, we've talked a little bit about adults, but now we need to do some prep for our kids too. Douglas Wilson, in a book called The Father Hunger, he says, gracious parents lead their children through the minefield of sin. Gracious parents lead their children through the minefield of sin. Indulgent parents watch their children wander. Legal parents chase them there. We need to create safe environments where we are gracious to our kids. That means starting early, having conversations early, 4, 5, 6, and 7. They need to know where their bathing suit area. We have some books online that can help you with that. Age-appropriate conversations, because children aren't ready for teen talks, and teen talks don't want to be talked to like kids. I want to encourage you to get that calendar out, and you're going to mark out at least every other month. You're going to have a deep conversation with your kids. And you're like, really, that's it? Every other month? The problem is you're probably not doing that now. It's very easy to let time slip by where you have a real deep conversation about something. And you're going to choose something like, what apps are appropriate on my kids' phones? And you can dive deep into that. If you're taking notes, there's a website called Protect Young Eyes, protectyoungeyes.com, and it lists apps and descriptions about whether those would be appropriate for your child. So you can have a discussion very specifically about apps. I just gave you your first discussion. Have many conversations that life provides. You know, I got my daughter's report one time, and this boy was using some bad language on a social media site, on her site, and he said, so I was just driving with her, and I said, how can I turn this into a conversation? So as we're going down the road, I said, honey, do you know that you have a lot of power as a young woman? And boys, they just kind of, she's probably about 13 at the time. And boys, they just have this thing, like a little ego thing. They want to feel respected. And they want to feel like they're okay by you. And you tell them that if you see a boy using foul language around you, you just say, hey, if you want to hang out with me, you better not talk like that. And she came home like another day and she said, Dad, that totally worked. This boy was cussing on our sidewalk. And I said, if you want to hang out with me, you better not talk like that. And he began apologizing in front of all of his friends. It was cool. You are the best influence your kids have. Nothing is off limits. I'm going to give you this one thing. This is something you can do right away. I call it the freak out dad game. My son was 8. He's exposed. I stole this from Dr. Doug Weiss, so you can feel free to steal it here. But my son was 8 years old. He's been exposed. And I've got to have these training conversations with him to prepare him. And I say, son, you just need to understand that nothing you can say can freak me out and that we can talk about anything. And you go in the other room and I want you to make up a story and you come out and you just try to freak me out. And he says, okay. So he goes in the other room and he comes back and he says, Dad, me and the boys were down at the gas station getting the Slurpees. And it was like, he never went down to the gas station with his friends at that age. But he's freaking me out. And he says, and one of them had a magazine they got in Dad's closet and it had pictures in it. And I said, okay, what'd you see? And how'd that make you feel? And I said, son, we do this, we role play this because pornography is designed to give you secrets, and secrets will make you sick. But if we talk it through, if we uncover it, if we unveil it, does it have an opportunity to stain your heart and stain your mind and stain your soul? I love accountability in my life. I have a friend of mine, Luke Gilkerson, who says people like to think of accountability as the last resort. We only tell our junk when there's just no other way out. I want to tell you it's the most beautiful lifestyle. Accountability makes me a better husband. Accountability makes me a better dad. Accountability makes me a better servant. Accountability makes me a more pure man. One of my accountability partners, he's an associate pastor at my church, and he said to me one day, Sam, there can be no accountability without vulnerability, and there can be no vulnerability without grace. There can be no accountability without vulnerability, and there can be no vulnerability without grace. I want to challenge you to be gracious to each other, to be accountable to each other, to have the conversations with each other. I'm going to leave you with a verse. This is easy for you to remember. 2 Timothy 2:22. Got that in your head? Say it with me. 2 Timothy 2:22. So flee youthful passions and pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace, along with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. 3 commands. Run from. That means you put barriers in the way. Wherever your hang-ups are, maybe it's cable, maybe it's whatever it is, run from. You don't allow your eyes to linger. You move. You specifically go to places where you know that there's temptation that way. Run from. Number 2 is run to. Run to. We need to have those healthy habits in our life. Daily disciplines of prayer and Bible reading. Run to the relationships that draw you closer to the Lord. Drawn to those, maybe it's that activity, that hobby, that all those things that God designed you for enjoyment. And number 3, run with. Run with those who call on the Lord from a pure heart. Be gracious and loving to each other. I'm going to invite Karen to come up, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about our communities. Play that video now.
Hello, and thank you so much for letting us come out today to talk to you. My name is Karen Potter, and I'm the director of the Communities Project at Covenant Eyes. I'm a wife and a mom, so the struggle is real. I'm right there with you guys. I understand it. But we can't fight this battle alone. We have to join together. It's essential that we fight together and take back control over things in our lives that are causing us to sin. The dangers facing our families online, they're real. And we have to do something. That's one reason that I protect my family with Covenant Eyes. As Christians, we know we need each other. We need to be accountable to one another. We need the community, and that's why we started our Communities Project at Covenant Eyes. So after a short video that just talks a little bit about our mission, I would encourage you to join us in the lobby to learn more about Covenant Eyes and the community that was specifically created for your church.
I'm going to play this video, but that'll tell you a little more about communities. But I think we have time for Q&A. Is that right? Or we can have just a few questions answered. If I can get it going here. I'm sorry.
The monkey with his hands over his mouth, not wanting to speak of evil, the majority of pastors and Christian leaders are keeping silent about this evil that is destroying the minds and hearts and souls of children, teens, and young adults.
We have the most significant problem in our church that we're dealing with right here. No other problem affects more people in the church.
Just know, as we already do, that this material is more aggressive, more harmful, more violent, more degrading and damaging than any other time in the history of the world. And this generation growing up is dealing with it to an intensity and scale no other generation in the history of the world has ever had to.
A difference can be made. The church can be restored if people are willing to do something about it.
I know you want to hear the sounds of chains falling off of men and increasingly women, and of those breaking free from the bondage of pornography.
Accountable families that take the spiritual formation of their families seriously are successful in passing on their values from one generation to the next. I will do whatever I can to help you in this cause, but you know, I really cannot do it without you. And so that's why I'm here asking for your help. Will you please help me?
All right, thank you.
Let's give them a huge round of applause up here. Just a couple closing thoughts for you guys. First of all, this meeting today really is a call to arms. It's a call to the battle. You know, Scripture says, "Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking who he may devour." And this is a big issue, and it's a lot more comfortable, I think, to bury our heads in the sand and pretend that it's not there. But this is a big issue. You know, if you have kids and they're online and they've got their wireless headphones and they're playing the video games and people are chatting and they're getting conversations with people, you know that the messages of the world are coming into your home. You guys have heard me preach. I talk a lot about my family. You know, when I was 6 years old, my dad left, and it was because he started down the path of sexual sin, and it destroyed our family. And it didn't take me too long in ministry to realize that this is a tough issue for adults to handle, that it really is a hard issue. I was a junior high youth pastor, and I literally walked to a room, and a group of 10 of my students were in a room, and this is when This was when I was like 22, so the internet was still getting started. And I heard them all talking, and they said, hey, you know, when you go to a site your parents don't want you to look at, all you have to do is go to 30 sites afterwards, and it bumps it off the history. And this was 20-something years ago. I was like, oh, man, I have no chance to fight this battle. And so I agree with what they're saying with the community. It's a hard issue. We have to engage and have conversations and talk about these things. So I've asked Josh to come up as our director of student ministries to talk to some of the youth that are here and also the family. So give her a big round of applause, Josh.
You know, I think today, and just hearing that talk and just thinking about students on down to children and being a father, I think one of the most critical things we need to keep in mind is the authentic community and having those conversations and having all types of conversations. I think too often as parents, even as members of a body, we kind of depend on quote unquote professionals to raise our kids. And whether that's in the sports world, right? We drive up and drop them off at practice. I remember early on, like, no way, I'm not letting some crazy sports dad yell at my kid. I'm going to stay there, right? And I'm amazed, like, out at practices, how parents stay. But then being in student ministries for a number of years, how many parents just kind of drop them off and go. And I would just encourage you, it's not just in one aspect of your child's life. You need to be involved in all aspects of their life. I know one of the goals Peggy and I are working on is even just a mentorship program where women of all ages, all the way down into students, can be mentored by other women. And I want to see that happen with our young men as well, because that is what being in a church, being in the church in an authentic community is all about. And starting those conversations, but starting them in a way where there is grace showed and that it is happening often. And, you know, too often we allow those things to slip off and we don't address them. And when we do, is maybe as a dad or as a mom, our first reaction is fear and then almost anger out of that. And that that closes doors so quickly. And so I just encourage you, stay involved, get involved. You know, as your student gets older, if you have stayed away, it's really hard to re-engage. For you parents, if you are here and you've got younger children, I would say the first place you should be even volunteering is in our children's ministry. Because it's really weird to your student when you've not been involved with them their whole life, and then at 16, you're like, hey, I want to know what you're doing. They're like, back off. You haven't cared the last 15 years. And so I would just encourage you, maybe you're here and you're a grandparent and you bring that grandchild to church, like stay involved in their life. Maybe you're a college student and you're looking for a place to serve, like get involved and start mentoring someone else or whatever it may be. But that's part of developing that authentic community that I believe is crucial to not just addressing this issue, but conquering this issue in many different lives. So I would just challenge you to think through how can you be a part of developing authentic community with people within your family and within your church.
I think it's important for us as a church. We want to impact this society that we're a part of. And I love that, you know, in the sermon this morning, we're talking about Daniel, and it said, Daniel resolved in his heart not to defile himself with the king's food. And I think it's important for us to make a resolution in our own hearts too, because really this is a hard issue. You know, you're not going to be able to control your kids. You can put on an act at church, but if you want to look at something, you're going to look at something, and you'll find a way around anything that you might put in place to hold you accountable. It has to start in your heart. And I think of our society, and I just want to say, I really believe that our church has a responsibility and an opportunity to reach the community that we're a part of. And I think it starts by separating ourselves from some of the things that are common around us. I think purity of our heart. You know, not just pornography, but a purity, a desire to represent God and to walk with him is a good place to start. And so this is the beginning of a discussion. We're so happy that Covenant Eyes could be here. They're going to have a booth out back. They talked about the Covenant Eyes community. If you're interested in that and the accountability and what they talked about up here, you can go back there and get information. They're offering our church 60-day free trial to try it out. If you want that as a tool for your family, I encourage you to go back and have a conversation with them. What I'd like to do is just have everybody just stand up right now as we close our time together. Just stand up, grab the hand of the person next to you, especially if it's your family. I just want to pray as a body of Christ, trying to be pure in this difficult world. Let's pray together. Father God, we're so grateful for who you are, and that you've called us not just to purity so that we can know you better, but you've called us to leadership and ministry. And so it's vital that we stand apart so that we can have a ministry on the world world that we're a part of, and we don't want to bury our head in the sand. We know what's out there. We know the radio songs and the movies and all the online content that's out there, God, but we want to set ourselves apart and dedicate ourselves to you. And so, God, my big prayer for us as a church that this would be kind of a call to arms, a beginning of the discussion of how we live as righteous followers of Christ in a sinful world. It was no different in Bible times than it is today. It's the same thing, and we need to start with a desire and a clear intention to live for you. So, God, I pray that the seeds that were planted in our hearts today will bloom, that our families will start having these conversations, that the kids and the adults can come together and have honest, open discussions without shame, without judgment, but conversations about how we walk with God in this world. And so, God, thank you for this time that we've had together. I'm so grateful for every single person that came. We ask this in Jesus' name. All God's people said,